Good afternoon from New York City. I'm Joel Natividad, and welcome to the third episode of the U.S. Open Knowledge Network's monthly webinar on all things open knowledge, open data that is useful, usable, and used. Bert?
And of course, this is a good morning to everybody from Hawaii. We're at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I just want to let people know that I haven't not had my first cup of coffee yet, so just be forewarned. My name is Bert Lum, and we're very fortunate to have three great speakers this morning from Sunlight Foundation and Gilbert, Arizona. We have a lot of great content and of course, a bunch of announcements to make, so let's get right to it.
Thank you, Bert. So here's the agenda for today. Just some quick introductions to our speakers. A quick recap of the last webinar we had with data.gov and the Sunlight Foundation. And we'll get right to the meat. We'll have the Sunlight Open Cities team, Greg, tell us about how to get people excited about open data. And we'll have Derek from Gilbert, Arizona, share how he's doing it in their town. And of course, we want this to be a conversation, so we left plenty of time for Q&A. But you don't have to wait until the end. You can raise your questions using the technology we're using, GoToWebinar. So I'm sure since you're logged in, you know how to use GoToWebinar. The only feature I wanted to call out was the Q&A feature. So if you have any questions, please enter your questions there so we can look at them and give them to the speakers, forward them to the speakers at the end. So with that, let's get right to it. Bert, can you have a quick intro?
Oh, you did? Okay, sure. So let's see. This is a monthly webinar, and of course, Joel is doing a great job pulling together all the resources to make that happen. And just by way of a quick background, I've been doing the sort of carrying the torch for open knowledge in the U.S. since 2014, and of course, I started the Code for Hawaii Brigade here in Honolulu, and also a nonprofit 501c3 called Hawaii Open Data. And of course, we are here to promote and advocate for open data in Hawaii.
Great, thanks, Bert. And I'm Joel Natividad. I've been in the open data space since 2010. I got into it when I entered the then Mayor Bloomberg's Open Data Challenge here, NYC Big Apps. Then when I won it the second time around, I decided to make a go at it and try to make a living opening data. So it's been a great adventure. And then that's how I got into the CCAN project, one of the Open Knowledge Network's marquee project, and I've been helping steer them along. And my day job right now is with OpenGov, where I still am doing the hard work of helping governments open data.
Yeah, you're doing a great job, Joel. I just wanted to add that in there.
Well, still work in progress.
We've got three speakers today. And from the Sunlight Foundation, we have Greg Jordan Dentimore. Greg is a developer. He's a data GIS analyst and designer with particular interests in government, cities, transportation, and parks. He's an open cities technologist over at the Sunlight Foundation, working with the Sunlight Open Cities team, helping cities across the country with open data. He's also an active member of Code for DC, the Code for America Brigade over in Washington, D.C.
And from Gilbert, Arizona, we have Derek Konofalski. Derek is a data technology analyst from Gilbert, Arizona. Something I found out, it's the most populous and fastest growing incorporated town in the U.S. It grew from 5,700 people in the 1980 census to 210,000 people almost in 20 years, which is amazing. He's a self-described technologies and nerd for the Office of Digital Government. He runs the Spark App League, a mobile development challenge for high school students, and the town's Open Data Initiative, among other things. And he's a full stack developer as well. He manages local 311. So he's the hopefully the main thing that runs all the technology for such a large town. So I'm interested to hear more from Derek. And we also have joining one of Derek's creations, Alex, but I won't steal Derek's thunder. I'll let Derek introduce Alex later on during the talk. So once again, thank you everyone for accepting our invitation. So let's get right to it. But before we do that, a quick recap of the last webinar we had with data.gov and Sunlight Foundation talking about the U.S. City Open Data Census. I just wanted to remind everyone that the webinar recording as well as the slides for the webinar are all available on the U.S. Open Knowledge, on the Open Knowledge Forum. Just go to discuss.okfn.org and you can avail of the recording. And even if you have some follow-up questions, that's why we post it in a forum. Feel free to post follow-up questions. We wanted to make this evergreen content that people can keep coming back to.
Sounds good. And of course, going forward, we'll keep posting all the webinars on the forum so we can continue the discussion even after this webinar. And that's it for housekeeping. Without further delay, I'd like to turn it over to Greg from Sunlight Foundation and the Open Cities team. Greg is basically, we basically, we stole from your LinkedIn bio. So if there's any errors, we can just blame it on LinkedIn. But Greg, tell us more about what you're up to and then what some of your background is.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yes.
Cool. So hi everyone. Again, my name is Greg and I'm the Open Cities Technologist here at the Sunlight Foundation. Just to give you a little bit of background, the Sunlight Foundation, if you don't know it, is a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization focused on open government. And a lot of what we have been known for is our work at the federal level, but a few years ago we actually started a team focused on local policy, which is now what we call our Open Cities team. And so over the past 3 years, we've helped over 50 cities around the country pass open data policies. And a lot of our work over that time has been focused on open data policies. But we've been doing a shift recently. So if you imagine, you've got an open data policy, you've got an open data portal, great. Is anyone actually using that data? So our new focus is on helping governments facilitate community use of open data. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. What do we, for this presentation, what do we mean by openness? So a lot of the premise for this webinar was about open data, but I'm also going to talk about some things relating to open government more broadly. So that's just a quick note there on openness. So I basically want to explore a sort of three-step framework for this presentation. What is the challenge that we're talking about? What are some common reasons for this? And what are ways to overcome those barriers? So here's our scenario that we're going to imagine. Imagine we have a lonely person in an IT department who's been working on publishing open data and is totally excited about open data, but it doesn't seem like anyone else cares about open data. And one sort of note for here is that you personally may or may not be this person, but we're going to imagine that you're this person, and hopefully, regardless of who you are, inside, outside government, whatever, hopefully there should be some ideas in here that are helpful for you. We talked about our lonely person publishing open data, no one seems to care. That really splits into two things, which is that other staff in the government don't seem interested in open data, and that the community doesn't seem interested in open data. And so I'm going to talk about ways to address each of those two things. But one thing that I do want to be really clear about is that regardless of the sort of internal, external framing, in both cases the goal here is still helping the community. It's just that internally it's getting people internally excited about a thing that is helping the community. And so, yeah, so we want to make sure that you always keep in mind, the goal here is the public benefit. But if we imagine our lonely person, they've probably talked to other people about the, all the wonderful public benefits of open data, and that still wasn't getting people excited. And so for our selling staff internally, I can certainly say here at Sunlight, we've had city staff like this come to us and say, hey, I just can't get people excited. Maybe, do you have any tips on things we could tell people about how open data will also help themselves? So I'm going to discuss a few ideas for that. So here are sort of 6 different strategies you can think about in terms of things you could say to, for example, someone in another department who is not yet sold on open data. And I'm going to go through each of them in detail. But they're about, it can help you all help each other. It can help reduce the number of public records requests that you're getting. It can help address a lack of public trust in your department's work. It can help engage the public more generally. It's a pilot, and there's policy that says we all have to. So let's look at the first one here. So I want you to imagine a scenario. We've got, people in some department talking to each other, and Bob says, where do we get the data on park locations? And Alexa says, I usually ask Jade at the planning department. And then Mateo says, that's funny, I've been asking Alex at the parks department. And so we have a situation where different people are relying on different personal contacts, including having to call them and email them in order to get data from other departments. And this is both a cumbersome process, and they might even be getting different versions of the data. And so what is, some way that could help alleviate this? What if they could just go to the open data portal and there's the data set right there? So yeah, if you imagine our group of people who are sitting together, imagine they all say, which data set's the right one? And Bob says, if only there was a single place where we could all get it. So that place could be the open data portal. Here's a lovely example of park locations. And so in real life, this is something, a lot of open data staff in city governments have told us that, when they launched their open data program, they might not have been expecting it, but one of the biggest positive benefits ended up being that it made life easier for city staff themselves. Yeah, so that's that. And let's go on to the second strategy here. So you might be able to tell someone it can help reduce the number of public records requests that you're getting. So I have a specific example here. We recently worked with the city of Glendale, Arizona, and they sent us their data on all of their public records requests for 2016. And so we went through and cleaned the data and sorted it into which offices and departments the different public records requests were getting referred to. And I know there's a number of small department and office names here on the left that you can't see. But the important thing is these orange bars that I've pointed out here, these are all types of requests that were going to a single department. And so, and it was for a few different types of data, but not that many different ones. And so we said, gee, there are a few key data sets where if they opened those, they could be having so many fewer public records requests to deal with. And that ultimately means staff time that's being saved. And so, in reality, in our engagement with Glendale, we've been working on them on getting these data sets public and then being able to promote them once they are all public. So that's another possibility here. Our next strategy is that it can help address a lack of trust in your department's work. So for any number of reasons, there are various departments that the public may be very skeptical about or mistrust. And publishing open data and other kinds of open information can help address that. So for example, here, one thing that's, due to the various number of incidents over the past few years, police departments have come under, they've always been in the spotlight, but especially in the spotlight. And so we've seen the birth of things like the Police Data Initiative. And so, what a lot of cities are seeing is that by, obviously this is large and complicated, but one of the things that they may be able to do to help address this issue of trust is to publish data on all sorts of different police-related things. But it could be, any number of things. Suppose that people are upset about long ambulance response times. At least, putting out that data on response times can help people feel like they, can see what's going on, and even if this might not fix the issue at hand, at least people can see that you're being transparent, and they'll be able to see if things change. Another example that's not even what you might think of as data per se, but imagine, there are all sorts of decisions that departments are making, and a lot of times the public doesn't know everything that goes into these decisions, and so sometimes it can seem like, gee, like why does this department do this or that? And so even if you, for example, say you have an internal analysis or memo about this kind of thing, releasing these things can help people see the thought that goes into your decision making. Being open about data and other kinds of information can help address a lack of trust in your department's work. It can also be useful just more generally for engaging the public. So something that especially, just department staff, those who interact with the public a lot might hear, people might just think of, the government or the whatever department, and they don't feel like they know what's going on, which is an issue for any number of reasons. And so what we're trying to do here is help peel back the curtain. And so transparency, again, thinking about trying to convince a department staff person, presumably they're interested in engaging the public. And so the idea here is that by being more open, it makes it easier for people to connect with you. And in particular, I want to point out that when departments are more open about their limitations and their opportunities, it makes it easier for the public to give them ideas that are actionable. So just for one specific example, here in DC last summer, the city had an event called Formapalooza, and what they were doing was a process of redesigning a few important paper forms that people have to fill out in the city. And so one of the parts for me that was very interesting was the constraints that were put in there. So like, first of all, it was, they're not making digital forms. It was, right here now, we're just trying to redesign the paper ones. And also that whatever new forms that people are proposing, so they're soliciting ideas from the community. And whatever redesigned forms they were going to have, were going to have to be maintainable by, they're going to be created by a small office, maintainable by various staff, and so they would probably have to be in a format like Microsoft Word. And so having all those, these kinds of things were limiting, it helps make it easier to make suggestions for, actionable improvements. So we're trying to, if you see these pictures here, we want people to think of the government less as this thing on the left, which is a real government building, it's a courthouse, and more like this thing on the right, where there are actual people in the government. Our next strategy, useful for many things. It's a pilot, which means two things. On the one hand, it can make it seem less scary, especially if people are afraid, when they hear about open data program, they're like, uh-oh, is this going to take a whole bunch of staff time? Is this going to cost a lot of money? It can make it sound less scary. And on the other hand, it can also make it sound like an exciting opportunity. So it cuts both ways, and this is certainly a technique that's been used by government departments for any number of things that are not open data, but it works for open data too. And finally, of course, there's a policy that says we have to. So many of you might be in cities that already have open data policies, but if you don't, you can certainly push for one. And I do want to give a quick plug. We have a number of tools on our website that can help you do that. In particular, we have our open data policy wizard, where you can, if you just enter a few details about your city, it'll send you a sample open data policy that you can then use to work off of. And it incorporates all of our 31 best practices for open data policies. So yeah, definitely push for a policy if you don't have one. Also, even if there's no legal mandate, and it's important to note that a lot of policies don't really have a mandate because they're just executive orders or council resolutions. You might be able to tie this into other things that are going on in order to create pressure. So suppose you might be able to have, especially if the mayor or the city manager publicly commit to a certain data set release schedule, which adds more pressure than just even, the mayor said, we want to release X data. We're going to release X data by September 1st. It's kind of a different story. And then also, you might be able to tie open data work into other laws or processes. So for example, if there's a big bill about police transparency, you might be able to talk to people and get some things included in there about specifically open data. Or another idea is suppose that you have a new comprehensive plan that your city is working on. You might be able to, again, get stuck in as part of this process that you have to open data about all sorts of things, planning, housing, transportation, environmental data, parks, you name it. So there are a lot of different opportunities, even when there are various subject-specific things going on, to get open data tied into policy or law or process. So again, just to review, these 6 different strategies for ways you might be able to convince other department staff. We're telling them that it can help them help each other. It might help reduce the number of public records requests. It can help address a lack of public trust in your department's work. It can help engage the public more generally. It's a pilot, and there's a policy that says we all have to. And I do really want to reiterate something I said at the beginning, which is that, remember, even though I frame this as overcoming internal barriers, again, our goal here is still serving the community. These are just about getting people internally excited about a thing that serves the community. So we want to make sure the community is still our goal here. So now let's look at what we might call external barriers, which was the community doesn't seem interested in open data. So there are a few different, somewhat interconnected ideas here for how you might be able to change this. The first is to just go to community organizations and ask them about their information needs. So, one thing we've heard from a lot of cities is that people aren't, a lot of people don't really seem to be clamoring for open data or data at all. And that may be true, but if you talk to organizations, it turns out they do actually, there is almost certainly information that they're looking for. They might not have been thinking of it as data or open data. And so, by talking to organizations about what their information needs are, you might be able to uncover places where open data very much is something that they want. You can also see if there are any local civic technology groups that you might be able to partner with, including but not limited to Code for America brigades. And on this note, one thing I want to point out is that there may be different regional organizations that you can partner with. So for example, Code for Boston, which is the Boston Code for America Brigade, is not literally limited to the city of Boston. They don't even have their meetings in Boston, they're in Cambridge. And so, a lot of times there may be some sort of group that you can partner with that may have, their name might have the name of, an adjacent city or town, but they might actually still be very interested in working with you. So that's another thing. And then I want to talk a little bit about our new approach called tactical data engagement. So as I mentioned at the beginning, our team's focus has shifted from helping cities pass open data policies to helping cities facilitate community use of open data. And so if you go to sunlightfoundation.com/TD, you can read a whole bunch more. But so basically what the guide outlines is a 4-step process, which we call finding, refining, designing, and implementing. And what you're basically doing is looking for, what are opportunities out there for connecting people with data and for open data that the community might be interested in. And then kind of narrowing that down, refining a specific use case where open data might help address a community need, and then designing and implementing a solution for that. So just to give you one really quick example, back in Glendale, Arizona, we have been working with them on 2 different pilot tactical data engagement projects. And one of those, you'll remember I talked about they had a department that was getting an enormous number of public records requests. What we said to them was, hey, since you have so many requests going to one department, it sounds like, there are data sets that people are really interested in here. And so if we can get those open, that might help people answer questions that they've been trying to answer. And so we actually interviewed a bunch of people in the community who were frequent records requesters to ask what it is that they were really looking for, what they were trying to do. And then using that, we worked with the city to create a few pages on their open data portal that help lay out different open data sets that they're going to be opening. And we're now going back to some of these same people and interviewing them and asking if these new open data sets and these pages that explain the open data sets would help these people get the information that they were looking for. So again, sunlightfoundation.com/TD, you can read a whole bunch more. Yeah. So that's all I have. If you want to find out more about all the different work our team has been doing, sunlightfoundation.com/opencities is your place. We also have an email newsletter that we send out, which is filled with a lot of awesome stuff. It's not only promoting our work, but different other related things as well. You can also follow us on Twitter. With that, we can move on to Gilbert.
Oh, thanks, Joel. That's great. Greg, I really appreciate all the stuff that the Sunlight Foundation does and the work that you folks are doing in, in this Open Cities. And I guess, I don't know if you mentioned it, but the work that you folks are doing in association with Bloomberg and What Works Cities, I think, that's a great partnership there as well. Anyway, I want to thank you very much for that great presentation. And I want to now hand it over to Derek from Gilbert, Arizona. And of course, I'll give him a chance to describe some of his background and his involvement, as well as I also want to remind everybody that if you want to submit any of your questions, you can go to the Q&A section and submit those there as well. So Derek, take it away.
Thanks so much, Bert. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay.
Yes.
I am Derek Knofalski from Gilbert, Arizona. I think my intro at the beginning was pretty good. I'm a self-described technologist and nerd. So I think my main passion when it comes to my job and what I do is finding a way for technology to make it easier for people to engage with their government and making that connection. I live in Arizona. I don't know if most people know about Arizona, but there's a lot of distrust in government. I think just in general in our country, but in Arizona as well. And so kind of, being able to bridge that gap between what the government does and what, it's providing people is kind of what I'm passionate about. So I just want to kind of start talking about a lot of what I'm going to say is pretty similar to what Greg just went over, but I really just kind of want to mesh that with a real-world example. We just launched our open data portal not too long ago at the end of last year. And so when we were going through this process, we kind of went through what Greg talked about. So we started off with asking ourselves, what does it mean to be open? And when we started our process at the beginning of this, they mentioned that I run a program called Spark App League, where we teach junior high and high school students how to code. And one of the things that we wanted to do to get those students involved with civic tech was give them data from the town. And so we would host these 2 events and give the students data, real world data that the town was using. But we didn't update it after the events. We didn't, really give them all the data. We mainly just gave the students data surrounding a theme. So we kind of took a few steps back and said, if we're going to do this, we want to take a look at how this can benefit not just students, but everybody. So we went and basically decided that when we wanted to do open data, we meant open by default. And that's a kind of just a philosophy that a lot of municipalities and cities and towns are now adopting, which basically means that the data that we're using, the data that we're releasing, it already belongs to residents. It's already their property, so they should have easy access to it. Right now, the only way for residents to get access to any of this data that we're talking about is to put in a public record request, as Greg mentioned. And that can be a process. It's a process for people. It's a process for us. And the other thing that we wanted to make sure that we did is, because this information is already accessible to people, we wanted to give it to them warts and all, meaning that if we're using that data for something, then that's the data that we should be providing. We shouldn't try to hide things. We shouldn't try to, change stuff. If we're using that data in our day-to-day operations, then that's data that people have. And then lastly, the big thing that we wanted to make sure of was that when people go to access the data, there's no barriers and there's no obstacles, which again is kind of a principle of the concept of open data. People shouldn't have to log in order to access the data. They shouldn't have to go through some kind of registration process to be able to access it. They should just be able to go to a website that you have set up, or go to a place that you have set up, and be able to at least view that data and download it if that's possible. And to me, a lot of these things are kind of scary. So I personally, when I hear about, scary things, that's kind of exciting to me, because I think that people do their best work when they're outside of their comfort zone. So it's kind of weird to hear, and I hear this all the time. So, like Greg said, why is no one excited about this? Next slide. So why is nobody excited about open data, or why is nobody excited about the town being transparent, or why is nobody excited about, people getting what they're paying for kind of in their hands? And we typically get two types of pushback. In our organization specifically, we got pushback from staff, and you can put up all these bullet points for staff at the same time. But it was basically, well, what's the point of doing this? Why are we going to put in all this work, if people can just do a public records request anyway? Some people were worried about, well, people might use this data against us. Especially with what's going on with public safety in general, the residents might use data against us. Or worse, the residents may point out that we're doing something wrong, and then we have kind of this black mark. It's super embarrassing. Or, what if we're doing things right, but there's mistakes in the data? Or this is going to add more work for me. I'm strapped as it is. I don't have the time nor the resources to do this. It's stuff that you hear everywhere, and all of those things are true. Every single one of those. People may use the data against you, but that's not really what typically happens with this. Residents may point out that you're doing something wrong, and if that's the case and they're right, then guess what? Now you can get started on fixing whatever you're doing wrong. Same thing with, what if there are mistakes? If there are mistakes, again, warts and all, if there are mistakes and a resident points it out to you, that's a perfect opportunity for you to not only acknowledge that what the resident is saying has meaning and value and is valid, but that you are going to work to fix those mistakes. It might add more work for some people, but in our experience, the goal is to make the process easier for both employees and residents. And especially here in Gilbert, for residents, what we found about why people weren't excited about the data was two things. One, most of them didn't know what data was even available. And two, the people that do know that the data exists, or that they can use the data for these things, they were already requesting it through public records requests. So it wasn't like we had this small minority of people that knew that the data existed, but they were the only ones engaging with it. And like with most things, people that engage in that way are usually the people that have some kind of complaint, or the people that are more outspoken than everybody. We wanted to make this accessible to everybody, not just the squeaky wheels that were constantly requesting data from us. So I kind of feel like these are all excuses. Excuses. As we've mentioned, people already have access to this data. We were doing public record requests, as you saw in Greg's presentation. Some departments were even doing overwhelmingly the majority of public records requests. And a lot of the times, most municipalities don't have good ways of keeping track of which records requests are repeat requests. So you have people doing this work to collect this stuff and put it in a way that's deliverable to people. Well, that makes more work. Why not just be proactive and release the data that people are requesting all the time, which then has the added benefit of increasing trust. So most of the time, when people are asking for this data, they just want to verify or corroborate what they're being told. If, as I mentioned just a second ago, if there are actual problems, your residents can help you identify those problems. If there are mistakes, it's your responsibility to evaluate those mistakes with your residents. And most importantly, I think that, and I think a lot of people will agree, open data, if you just make it part of the work you're already doing, will be much, much easier for both you, your staff, and residents to get involved with. If you look at data that you're using on a day-to-day basis, you're making decisions with that data, you're reviewing that data, it might be helpful to have other people, other eyes on that same data. So it doesn't take that much more work to get that data out there publicly, especially since everything's on computers now. Everything, is in formats that people, or formats that software can read that people already use. It should just be part of your work already. So here's what we did specifically in Gilbert. We started first, as kind of Greg mentioned in his presentation, we started with the top first because we already had our Spark App League in our program. My boss, Dana Birchman, our Chief Digital Officer, and I had already had kind of the open data conversation with some of our management. So it wasn't a concept that was completely foreign to them. The idea that was foreign was taking this concept and making it kind of organization-wide. So we initially presented it as a way for our organization to kind of expand what we were already doing, and also as a way to apply to What Works Cities. So a lot of you might be familiar with the work that the Sunlight Foundation is doing with What Works Cities. It just kind of, it was an opportunity for us to kind of kill two birds with one stone and drive the point home that we were going to try to streamline a process that we were kind of already doing internally because people are using this data in our town to make decisions, but also that we didn't want to just limit the pool to students, which is who we were giving the data to initially. So the next step involved basically once we had management, and we're fortunate that our town manager, Patrick, kind of, again, he already got the idea. He was behind it when we kind of suggested it for our Spark App League program. So he was behind it, at least in a give me a better idea of what this is, kind of show me what the process would look like, and then pitch it to me. And that's basically what we did. And then the next step involved basically getting the organization involved with it. So as Greg mentioned in his presentation, a lot of the times what happens is municipalities will kind of write a policy, and then here you go, everybody, this is what you have to do from now on because it's the rules, the policies, and this is how we're doing it. We didn't want to take that approach because just from experience, that's the number one way to kill buy-in from people in your organization, is to just mandate that they have to do something this way. So instead, what we did is I set up an open data committee to help kind of look at the scope of what our open data program would be. What would the expectations be for our organization, what they would be for staff, what would we expect residents to do when we did this? Because obviously if we're going to put effort into something, we want to make sure that it's not just effort put into something that just gets put out there and then never used. So the committee that we put together consisted of one person from every department, and I essentially went to the directors of every single department in our organization and said, I want you to be part of this committee. If you don't think you're the best person, then I want you to nominate somebody or pick somebody to be a part of this committee. It hopefully is somebody that's familiar with the data that you're using or is familiar with the information that your department is generating. But if it's the director and the director wants to be involved in it, that's kind of our best case scenario. So our committee was a mix of directors from departments and people who were familiar with the data on a day-to-day basis. And with that kind of committee, we went through and defined what our open data goals were, what terms, when we say open data, what does that mean? And this kind of coincided right with the beginning of our What Works Cities engagement, because we did eventually get chosen to take part in What Works Cities. So while our committee was meeting regularly, we typically had meetings weekly or biweekly, depending on scheduling. But while this was happening, I worked with our IT director, and we essentially tried to figure out, one of the What Works Cities kind of principles is to take stock of what you have. And that's something that I think people need to kind of get comfortable with or do. It's a super important step in the process, is try to work with what you already have. So what we did is we went through with our IT director and looked at what would be the best way to get everything in a central spot. If we were going to do this, we wanted to kind of almost have like a beta version of an open data portal, but internally. So how do we get all that information in one spot internally so that our employees can look at that data? And then once we're at that point, how do we get it so that process kind of can be easily put into a public-facing open data portal? And so this is where we went in through this integration process. So open data has to be integrated. We tried to, whenever possible, automate everything for our staff. If we had staff that were already using certain software or if they were doing certain things, we wanted to make sure that their workflow didn't change too much. Obviously, it's not possible for their workflow to not change at all, but whenever we could, we wanted to make the process super easy for them. So part of what we did is to automate everything. And as I like to say, automate all the things. Whenever you can, it's just much easier when people don't have to worry about manually doing these processes. So part of what we did was, because we didn't want to create extra work, if people were inputting data into spreadsheets, we wanted to figure out ways where we could import data from their spreadsheets just by having them, as an example, upload that spreadsheet to a folder, and then we would automate the process of pulling that spreadsheet from a folder and reading the data from that spreadsheet. Or if we couldn't get them to upload their data into a specific spot that we could pull from, we made spreadsheets for them where they could copy and paste the data so that then they could just, have it automatically formatted in the way that we needed, and then they just copied and pasted it into a website that we created on our intranet. So the majority of what we tried to do was to have that information go on our intranet. We have a staff page for each department that they can either copy and paste their data into if we couldn't automate that process, or that we automated on the back end that automatically pulls from whatever system they're using. And so they can log into the intranet, go to their staff page, and they can just verify all that information or input that information if they need to. So from that, we kind of went top down. We started with management, we went to all the departments, and then we went to the actual data owners and integrated it as much as we possibly could so that it was already part of their existing workflow. So then from there, we've kind of talked about the first half of that piece, but then what about all the people that we're serving? Gilbert is actually super lucky in that 95% of our residents are data scientists. Obviously, I'm just kidding. No, they're absolutely not. Our population is not data scientists. Just like most places, your population is not going to be people that are super interested in data. But what people do want, as Greg mentioned earlier, is they want information, and they want that information in a way that they can understand it and that they have access to. If they have to go through a really drawn-out process to access that information, it's no good for them. If they have access to the information but they don't understand what it means, or they don't know how to use the file that you're giving them, or they don't know what the format or what software to use to access that, it's no good. Same thing too with staff. We have a lot of staff that work for the town that are also residents. But on top of that, staff too share data all day long. So we want them to also have easy access to the data. We also want it to be easy for them to digest. So ultimately, we know that residents just want this information. They want to be able to trust their government. They want to know that when the government tells them something, or when the government makes a decision on their behalf, that they're using the same data that they're providing, or they're using the same things that they're giving the residents. They're not trying to hide stuff. They're telling the truth. They're telling them exactly what they're using, and here's the information that we used to do that. So because of that, because we wanted to make sure that we provided data not just for our residents, but also our staff, but also for the data geeks and the non-data geeks, we wanted to be, as I like to say, like Oprah, but for data. And what that means is you get data, everybody gets some data. So even it doesn't matter how familiar you are with data science. It doesn't matter, if you have the software, if you've used the tools. So what we did is we split up our approach. We had a lot of conversations in our committee meetings on what would be the best way to actively engage our residents and make this culture of openness kind of a principle, not just for our residents, but for our staff. And so what we did is we essentially created 2 open data sites. The first one that we created was what you, I think, see from most municipalities, which is their kind of raw data, which for us is data.gilbertaz.gov. And when you go to our data site, you have access to the raw data sets, so people can download them. We have APIs that people can connect to if they want to make apps. And this is kind of what we were providing for our students and everything when they were making their games and apps through our Spark program. But then we also wanted to give the future data geeks, the people who maybe didn't know that they wanted data, the people that didn't know that this could be something awesome, another website, alex.gilbertaz.gov, where we kind of made it a little friendlier. And so some of you may be asking, well, data.gilbertaz.gov makes sense because it's data, but what the heck is an Alex? So Alex for us was our open data kind of customer-facing, our resident-facing open data platform. And for that, we created an open data avatar that we named Alex, who is waving to everybody right now. And Alex is basically our open data librarian. She was named after the Library of Alexandria in that we wanted people to kind of have a friendly face to our data. So when people go to alex.gilbertaz.gov, not only do they have access to our data set, but they also have access to stories surrounding that data set so that there's context about not only where we're getting that data from, but how we're using that data to compare what we do with other municipalities and how that data compares to other data sets that we've already released. And we're just getting started with Alex, but we're putting up visualizations for people that they can see, and as we release more and more data sets, we're going to have more of these stories, we're going to have more of these examples of how we're using the data, we're going to have additional visualizations for people to use. And then on top of that, I think what really separates it is we also have, Alex provides kind of tutorials. So for any of the stories that people go to, there's a button that they can click where Alex can give a tutorial. And if possible, I don't know if we have the time, if I can kind of show some of the things that we have available on Alex. Are we able to do that, Joel?
I'm afraid if we want to have a Q&A,
okay.
Maybe we can have a dedicated Alex webinar.
That's totally fine. That's totally fine.
Okay.
So the goal, though, is that people can go on there and hit a button, and as they're reading these stories of how we're using this data and how we're comparing it, Alex gives a little tour as well of how this data is being used. So with that, kind of just the summary of what these 2 different strategies together, or how they worked and how they help foster this openness, is we plan on putting Alex on nearly anything that we have data. So if there are public meetings that we're going to be posting notices for, we're going to have little pictures of Alex, so that means that there's data that people can go to this website. And if they're interested in what's going on with a public meeting, or if they're interested in what's going on with an initiative that the town has, and they see that little Alex icon, then that means that there's data available for them. They can go in there, they can see the data, they can see our explanation. So just in summary, I just want to give a few little bullet points. Make sure that your employees are thinking about the data while they're working on their strategies, because they're already accessing that data to make the decisions for those strategies. They'll have it kind of already in their workflow. Automate as much as you can, make the process as easy for them as possible. Think about how the data that they're using benefits residents and why it would benefit residents to know what's behind that data. And then share. Anytime something works out well, share it with your employees, share it with your staff, share it with residents. We run a free code camp here in Gilbert as well, where residents can help us with our tech projects and help us with our projects that we're working on. If you have a success in something like that, share it with residents, share it with people. post it on social media. Just give people ways to be involved. Give residents and employees both ways to interact and to be involved. And again, share your successes. That's it for me. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. That was really very, very interesting, Derek. Yeah, I mean, so now we're going to Q&A, and it's a shame we can't do a demo of Alex, but perhaps, Derek, if you have the time, maybe we can slot in the next webinar a dedicated, Gilbert, Arizona deep dive, if you're okay with that.
If people are interested in that, I would absolutely love to.
Great, that's good to know. So before we go into the Q&A, I just have one quick announcement. So just to confirm, we do have the first CCAN conference in Oakland, California on May 29. The website will be up tomorrow. That's not yet live, but you will see some of the great topics we'll be exploring. Even though it's called CCAN Con, it's not just about CCAN, it's about open data in general, open source and open standards. Fortunately, it's a free conference supported by, through the generous support of AWS, Deloitte, and OpenGov. We can host this conference for free. It's just a day-long conference. If you're going to the CFA Summit, I highly recommend you join us. It's literally across the street from the Code for the America Summit. So with that, let's go to Q&A. So let me pull up the Q&A here. But I have a question myself. One of the things, I help governments open data for a living myself, and oftentimes I encounter all these questions about, the utility of opening data. And sometimes what we're thinking of now is we look at the government staff as the first customer. And it's reassuring to see that, even Sunlight and in Gilbert, that's being done too. In terms of the strategies, Greg, you called out, do you have a prioritization that you go with this one first? Because Derek was saying he couldn't go with, oh, you have to do it, because that's a sure way to kill an initiative. Is that prioritized from go with strategy 1 first before you go to strategy 2? Do you have some kind of ranking of the strategies?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, so basically there wasn't really a priority on the list, except that the one about because there's a policy is sort of last. And that's, like Derek mentioned, if you frame it as you should do this because you have to, that's not the most inspiring thing. So, as I think I mentioned, the hope was that, just merely it's a public community benefit would be enough to motivate people. And if not that, then my suggestions about how it can help, how it can help department staff help themselves with, all of them except the because you have to, and then as a last resort, because you have to. Although one thing that is worth noting is that not that that's a great, first reason to give when you're going around, but what I have certainly heard from open data staff in different cities is that it makes a huge difference in whether or not people care, and that, a lot of times even, if there's just an executive order, departments just like almost by default will not prioritize it the way that they would prioritize it if it was a law. So so it's my least recommended thing to say, but it is often a very important factor in how much people do or don't prioritize it.
Derek, do you have anything to add to that perspective, to your insight that, mandating it is the surest way to kill it? I mean, what is the most effective one if you try to map it to the Sunlight's 6 strategies?
Yeah, I think, if we're looking at, and I don't disagree that I think that in some places that might be the only way to motivate people to do it. people have all different kinds of motivations for why they do what they do, and especially when it comes to their job. Some people are just motivated by, this is what I have to do, and this is what we've been told to do, and that's fine. I just think that when you have those kinds of situations, people need to find their own motivation for why they want to do stuff. So I like the strategies of, like departments helping each other, because, in all the different municipalities that I've talked to and that I've worked with in this open data process, that is a huge, huge benefit to them, is if you can convince people that, hey, this will make your job easier, then, that's usually motivation for people, because then they can start working on other, or they can start innovating. They can start doing things outside of kind of the day-to-day collection of data or the process that stuff goes through. So I think, anytime that you can get people to have an internal motivation, those things should be prioritized above anything else. Telling somebody to do something, it might work, it's just not the most effective way to do it. So yeah, I agree, it would probably be prioritized at the end, but you might need to do that. Some people don't care about engaging the public, but some people do. So, I actually think that the order that Greg put this stuff in is probably the order that I would even prioritize it in, because, if you can help, departments help each other, and then what was it like? Oh, reduce work, that kind of thing. I think those fall in line with exactly what we're talking about.
Okay. Yeah, actually, one tactic I've used is, and I don't know what your experience is, all these open data portals have a feature called private data. And that's why I tell them, publish the data as private data first, so you can use it for internal data sharing. And then, perhaps maybe you can use some other features that all these open data portals that solutions have now to allow you to redact that data. So it almost becomes part of their workflow.
Yeah,
So
and I want to mention one other thing too. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Oh, go ahead, Derek.
Oh, I was just going to say, rather than, I think maybe you can even frame it differently than, we have this policy, so we have to do this. In Gilbert, we didn't have a policy yet, but we were obviously pushing for one. So we kind of almost did a different take on that, which was, this is where we're going. We're going to have this policy. This is going to be something that we're doing. Do you want to get involved now and help us decide what we do for that, or do you just want us to tell you later after we figured it out, what you then have to do? I think getting people bought in that way too is a big benefit.
Okay.
Hey, Derek,
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Bert.
I just had a real quick question, and I really love the idea of Alex and the creation of sort of an avatar. What was the thought process that led to the actual creation? Did you have to really sell it to people, or how did you get the management to buy off on not only the creation but the ongoing management of that sort of storytelling concept?
Sure. So that concept came up actually very, very early in our committee process, because we had people on the committee, and it was basically, we had departments that had kind of a historical precedent, or things had happened in the past where residents had requested data from them, and we sent out the data or the information and then kind of some explanations of that, and those people didn't trust what we were saying. So there was kind of this, well, we want to put this data out there for people, but some people might be interested in what that data says but not know what it is. So if we provide context, though, then you're going to have the opposite problem, where the people who don't trust the government, they're not going to want to listen to that context, or they might even shoot in the other direction and say that's literal propaganda, that we're taking this information and because we're offering a version of it, or because we're offering an explanation or kind of the context around that data, that it might be propaganda. So kind of those departments that had that initial experience didn't want us to be providing context. They didn't want to do that. But then the people who were kind of interested in open data, but they themselves weren't data geeks, were like, well, but I know if we do this, it's not going to be useful for me, so how could it be useful for a resident? So that kind of branch appeared pretty early on in the process. And the way that we kind of got the buy-in for that was that, we would let the departments choose, or we would let the data owners choose if they wanted to provide this context for people or not. And if they did, it would be on a completely separate website so that people could get the data that they were looking for raw without any of our input if they wanted to. But if they weren't sure about it, they could get it from this other spot with that context. And again, as I mentioned before, we tried to automate as much of the process as possible. So Alex pulls directly from our data portal. There's no, differing data sets. If you go to Alex and you look at the data sets, they're being pulled from the same data that everybody else is getting it from. And the visualizations are also publicly available. People can download them. They can look at how we made the visualizations. So essentially we looked at Alex as just another resident using that data on behalf of a resident. And that, I think, really kind of resonated with the people that had those concerns, because it was like, okay, as long as we're providing that data without any of that context or without any of our meddling and input or whatever, that maybe people will trust that, and then they'll kind of give the Alex part a shot if there's something they don't understand.
Great. That's a great idea. Thanks.
Yeah. We have some questions from the community. So we have one question, actually not a question, a suggestion from Liliana Martinez. So I guess, Derek, you'll be on the next webinar because they're requesting, they want more information about Alex. Hopefully we'll coordinate that, but yeah, we'll work with Derek to make sure that we have a deep dive into Alex and what they're doing in Gilbert. We have another question from Jared. Awesome. We have another question from Jared Connolly. His question goes, my local government demonstrates little commitment to transparency and open data as a priority. What are ways to overcome this? So I guess the short answer to that, Jared, is we'll have the recording and the slides as ammunition for you to advocate for open data in your jurisdiction. But any words of advice to Jared? Greg, Derek?
I would ask why. I mean, that would be my first question, is if there's some kind of hesitancy. The question was that they don't show a commitment to open data. Did I hear that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So
they demonstrate
my
little commitment to transparency. I think the bigger thing is they don't want transparency.
Yeah, my question about that would be why, because ultimately all this data, all this information is the property of their residents. It's the property of the people that are, contributing to keep the government running. Everything that the government does, as you mentioned, is in service to, or as Greg mentioned too, is in service to your residents. So the question would be why, and I would push back. I would, start making that public. Ask why on social. I mean, does the government have like a social media presence, or do they have a way to get people involved? Because if not, I would say that the only way to do that is to put those questions out there for residents to be able to talk about. Use platforms like Nextdoor, where people are residents of that community, and get that conversation started. If the government is not willing to start that conversation, then you might have to kind of force their hand on it.
And Greg, do you have any numbers? Because oftentimes we hear that opening data is a great way to save on freedom of information processing costs. Do you have any solid numbers that they can share that, hey, this will make your government more efficient?
Unfortunately, I don't. Yeah.
But yeah, I think that visualization you shared earlier during your presentation, the amount of FOIA requests, if we can quantify that, I think it will be a great way to, have a quantitative, objective measures to show the return on investment on open data.
Yeah, well, I guess, so the one thing I would say, so for example, with Glendale's, they both had data on the number, but they also, for each request, tracked how much time was spent. And so, you could add that up. And so, in some other place, you could see if that government keeps this kind of data. A lot of them don't, but they might. And so if they do keep data on how much time is being spent on, like, say, a small group request for a small number of data sets, then, you could certainly add up those numbers.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. But I guess now we just save the date. I did, fortunately, I had a TBD to be determined for the next webinar, and I guess most likely that will be Derek and a deep dive into Gilbert. Hopefully, Derek, that date works for you. Bert and I will coordinate with you offline to confirm that. And once again, let's continue the discussion. All these assets, the webinar, the recording will be posted in the Open Knowledge Forum. Just join us there. If you have any more questions and follow-ups and suggestions, let's make it a conversation. Thank you, everyone.